those in defense of the environment.
And you believe that's recognized?
Through the national membership of these organizations, but without excluding, of course, the role of all of us collaborating to ensure that the system is as best as possible.
Antti, you wanted to come in, then I'll come to Andrew and Paul.
Yes, I think the quality is linked with the inclusiveness. That's clear. And about the time frame, I don't think it is a big issue, because anyways we have to change the ways of doing towards a more networking and trustworthy ways. So the advantage of Europe is probably that we have a long tradition in dealing with different interest groups here within Europe, and the others outside Europe have to learn that as well. And they have the issue of quality and inclusiveness and everything as well.
Thank you, Paul. Andrew, sorry. Arnold.
Yes, I think we need to remember that, in fact, the figures for 2017 show that the global consumer expenditure was 63.5% of GDP. So it's right at the centre, and we need to be at the centre of the activities on standardisation in order to get the right standards. So the involvement is important. I think the thing from the inclusiveness that comes through the European Standardization Regulation of 2012 is very much the support, the financial support for the stakeholders, and I think there ought to be some consideration, possibly how we can take this wider, because there was less success, I think, on the joint initiative on standardization as Action 10, which was around inclusive, trying to bring in some of the minor stakeholders in more detail. We may need to look at, I don't know, co-funding or something additional to help work at the national level. And of course, this is always difficult for the Commission, because they are Europe-wide rather than nationally, but I think there is space for some more work there to try and increase.
Because we tend to be focusing on the European and international, yes, and maybe forgetting.
Yeah, so I think we do need to work there. I mean, on the timing, I've always thought that where you've got something that's maybe for interoperability, you can do that quickly, you need to do it quickly. Yeah. But on some of the childcare work where I have worked, it's taken a long time. There's been different accidents in different countries, different ways of looking at things, and it's taken us time to come to a solution. But when we have come to a solution, that's been a robust solution, and it's lasted for many years. If I may have just one final point, you mentioned the new approach is dead. Well, I hope it isn't, because I remember working for the UK government, negotiating in Brussels before the new approach, and not only did I have to deal with the technical requirements, I then had to deal with the test methods, and as soon as we got the test method approved, we then had to go forward and amend it because new techniques had come out, and so on. So that part of the new approach, I think, is very successful, that it takes the technical side and puts it to the businesses and other stakeholders to work together on it, whereas before it was always done through the governments, and that is not to the advantage. But maybe it is time to take a look at whether it can be tweaked, can be improved in some way.
Thank you. Paul, on this inclusiveness question, I promise we're going to come back to the balance question, but I just want to deal with this one.
Business Europe is all for inclusiveness, because it's apparent that any standard, whatever standard, is helped by the presence and the engagement of all the parties that have something meaningful to bring in for that particular standard. And several things have been said. Sometimes it may be more difficult to achieve consensus if you have a broader palette of parties around the table. Well, so be it. That is the very essence of standardization, that you try to achieve consensus. This is also why we so much object to the notion that one single party could have so much influence or take so much influence. We do not necessarily believe in top-down measures to improve inclusiveness. We rather look at what are the things that really block inclusiveness. And there is a challenge at the international level, because allowing certain parties to directly take part is simply not compatible with the national representation model. So I would suggest
Sorry, can you very briefly explain what you mean?
conversations to try and resolve that somehow in a way that doesn't frustrate the fundamentals of the model and yet brings the objective of more inclusiveness to effect. But we also have to recognize, indeed, that the timeliness of standards can differ. Some standards need speed, others do not, like Arnold put forward. And some standards are helped a lot by consumers or workers bringing something in, and others are not because they do not even know what it's about. And we have to recognize that it's also a resourcing issue. The participants
so one of the issues of agility is to know what to do and which to use and how inclusive to be relative to the topic we're talking about. Greg, I'll give you a chance to come in a minute, but Neviana, on this international question, you were emphatically nodding earlier when Greg made the point. How do you see it?
Well, I wanted to go back on this inclusiveness issue
exactly.
because inclusiveness starts with raising awareness and education, what was discussed also in the previous panel. We, as European Standardization Organization, we are providing a free educational package on standardization, freely accessible. Go to our website, click on the link, and you will have it. There are already universities which are ready to start master's programs on European standardization. So we're there to help, and then we can have the SMEs who are usually not having enough resources to hire experts to explain them how standardization works or what kind of standards they need in order to place their products or services on the European market. So that's very important. Raise the awareness and start with education. Of course, on the inclusiveness issue, we have Regulation 1025. All the roles are well defined. We are meeting the Annex 3 organizations regularly in order to be sure that we are addressing adequately their needs.
Okay. Greg, you wanted to come in, then I'm going to go out to the room, and then we'll come back and we'll talk again about this issue of the relationship between the European and the international standard and how we get that balance that Arnold talked about earlier, how we get it right and see if we can find a way forward.
I wanted to kill this myth that, you know, there's environmental and consumer organisations and workers and who are just sitting around with nothing to do, waiting for a technical committee to join, even though we've got no interest in it whatsoever. What a lot of nonsense. We're immensely busy. So the reality is we will only join the technical committees where we have an interest, where we have a role, where we can make a contribution. You're not going to simply get lots of superfluous people joining technical committees and slowing the process down. And the second point I would make is if the national model of standardisation makes it difficult for organisations such as ours to participate, well, maybe that model needs to change. For the benefit of... Good heavens, yes, indeed. Maybe that model needs to change. We heard a lot in the first session about how flexible the standardisation system is. Be flexible to accommodate organisations like the environmental community and the consumers and so forth. And in that way, you will get the inclusiveness and you will get a better product at the end of the day, which is more credible.
You can respond in a moment, but let me just first go out to the room for any questions or comments. Just let me check. I will give you the floor, but I want to make sure I give priority if I haven't heard from someone. So it's the same three people. But if nobody else wants to, I'm happy to give them... No, you're in luck, gentlemen. Remind us who you are, please.
Sorry for bothering, but
not at all.
I'm representing the industry, and since the panel is more on the side of the bodies, I would like to share our experience. Yeah? So I'm the one who is responsible for Romania for intellectual property. I have the ideas here in my computer with regard to autonomous driving, for example. But I need to slow down the people in our R&D because I have to tell them, guys, it's all nice, but we cannot get access to the standard essential patents. So we are really slowed down. Now I learn from Tim about the situation in China. How should we, as the industry, compete with such a very well-organized system like in China?
And your answer is? Your own answer? To turn it on yourself?
I can tell it by myself just give us the guidance, give us from the European Commission, issue this complaint, give us the guidance, what is correct with regard to the front commitment made in ETSI, for example. How do we need to understand non-discriminatory? This is the issue. Not fair and reasonable. We don't talk about this. Non-discriminatory.
Okay, thank you very much. And back to AFNOR, where there we are, excuse me. Thank you very much.
Pascal Poupet from AFNOR, France. That's a response to Mr. Archer. Maybe an advice. The strategy is inclusiveness, and we don't expect NGOs to participate to all meetings. And we are, as a national body, very dedicated to work with our national NGOs and getting them on board when they need and when they have nothing. So that's the strategy. But another thing is tactics. If we project our Europeanness, our European way of organizing on the ISO and IEC stage, this is going to be counterproductive. So yes, we need to organize, but we don't need, we can't push to the international organization a type of organization and representation that will be counterproductive. We need to be intelligent together.
So push the principle, but not necessarily the practical way of achieving it. Would that be? I'm going to come around because I see one here, and then I will come back, and I know there's one in the middle as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Amanda Richardson from BSI in the UK. Well, this is a very interesting debate. So we just wanted to also comment that there is a lot of good, positive news out there as well. It's not all bad. Greg, I think you mentioned that national bodies are in fact responsible for engaging all of the relevant stakeholders in the standardization process. And as you know, there are a lot of very successful initiatives amongst many members at the European level for engaging environmental NGOs, the consumer associations, and other underrepresented stakeholders. You also mentioned, Greg, concerns at the international level and how it's important that committees are considering and taking into account environmental aspects in their standardization process. And this is very important. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that ISO and IEC also recognize the importance of engaging stakeholders in the standardization process in order to be transparent and deliver a successful standard. So I draw your attention to two guides that we've got at the international level, one on incorporating environmental aspects in standards, which all of our technical committees are encouraged to use and apply in their environment, and also another guide on incorporating sustainability aspects into standardization. That's currently just undergone a review. And there's a significant contribution there from environmental NGOs in updating and developing that. So it's not all negative, and I think if we continue to work together, we can ensure a strong stakeholder representation at the national level, feeding into the international environment.
Thank you, and thank you for those pointers to the guidelines. There are two more. I'm going to ask you to make them quick ones, because we still have some ground to cover before we break. Thank you.
Okay, Jacques with SGS, talking for Tech Council. What we see, we're talking about harmonization in the world, on a worldwide basis, right? So whether we would look into the GDPR, I was recently in India, and they mentioned the GDPR not as the general data protection regulation, but the global data protection regulation. Strike, right? This is what we want. Selling things to the world, making things better in a faster way. And what I was missing, and you mentioned that ETSI is active in China and other regions, supporting the other regions in generating their own standards to make them on a harmonized level. So what I'm missing here, the same for privacy. We don't even know what to be implemented in a device, in a service to comply with data protection in such devices. We are only talking about use cases, and this is missing. And this is a request to the standardization organizations, right, to be faster and to follow the in this case the law, but in this case it's positive, as it is driving harmonization.
Thank you very much indeed. And just whiz around here to save time. Thank you.
Salute the participants of this conference. Let me welcome
Can you say who you are, sorry?
My name is Timur Nurashov. I am from Eurasian Economic Commission. Very nice to meet you. I'm head of the Technical Regulation Department. Here I represent Eurasian Economic Union, which consists of 5 countries: Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. You know, we are a very young organization. This year we just celebrated 5 years from our establishment, but for this short period we passed to 20 or 30 years of European integration. As we said about globalization, from our view, the globalization is a communication between big regions. As mentioned today in video message, Ms. EU Commissioner, yes, right, thank you. She said that European standardization is a unique system, and it is really so. And our region is ready to go forward steps for this joint initiative on standardization. We are really proud of this, and we are ready to be open for this dialogue. But I want to say that, yes, the main reason to make our communication and in the trend, in the stream of globalization trends, standardization should be work on business interest. Every 2 weeks in our commission we have meetings with European businesses. They have many questions to our commission, and we need feedback from European authorities, from Sense and Senelec. I want to say everybody from Sense and Senelec and European Union so that we open to construct these dialogues to establish this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very good to hear from you, sir. Okay, let us come back, and really they were more comments and observations and suggestions rather than questions. So let us come back to the thorny issue of this balance, and how do we make sure we defend those values, as you underlined and Tim argued for so strongly. Oh, well held. Avoided a very loud disaster there, thank you very much. How are we going to get this balance right? Paul, a lot of things have been said in reaction to your comments. Do you accept there is a balance to be struck? Because you say European standards are deviating from international, and we need international in an international globalized world. Do you accept there is a balance to be struck, and if so, how do we get that right?
Well, let me start by commenting to the point about the GDPR, because I like that statement very much, and it illustrates what I said before. Yes, Europe can be leading by making very high level in the sense not of abstraction, but in the sense of strong requirements, legislation. And I think a lot of European citizens are happy that the GDPR protects their data well, and that is de facto something that the rest of the world has to digest. But that means that then there is a market interest for standardizers across the globe to make standards that meet the requirements of those European regulations. And that means that it is justified that the European legislator then has a certain level of trust in the standardization system, in the ability of the standardization system to deliver on that promise. And that is what it is about. And when you come with straitjacket mandates, yes, straitjacket mandates. A straitjacket mandate, which is intended to be the template for every future mandate, is being presented for the 3rd time in the COS, while the member states have resisted it. This is outrageous. It is unacceptable, because there are a number of arguments why it cannot work, and the Commission won't listen. And that is the balance that has to be struck. And then, yes, sure, there need to be consultants who verify if indeed the promise that justifies the trust in the standardization system has been delivered on for a particular standard. But that shouldn't be a check to go in each and every letter of the standard in detail, verifying if all the legalistic things have been covered.
I want to give Javier a chance to also react on that. And then, Antti, I'd like to come to you, because this debate we're having within standardization is a debate we have on a much broader level about European levels protection and whether they undermine or boost competitiveness. But Javier, specifically to this point,
I have nothing to react to. This is the European industry, the European companies telling us what they are expecting from this system.
But can we reconcile? I mean, can we find a way through this?
I'm sure, absolutely. I think, and Paul was telling me before, he was being provocative, I think the new approach is dead. I think the new approach, as we have known it for the last 30 years, is very hurt. But I think the model as such, if that trust is recovered, and if the regulator understands that we are in this partnership to make the life of our companies better so that they can make business under regulated and safety and security measures, this is what we are here for. So I have nothing else to add. Perfect. This is what they want. This is how we should try to articulate, we, the regulator, and the standards bodies.
Neviana, did you want on this specific point? Sorry, Antti, I will come to you, but yeah.
Yes, I also wanted to echo what my colleagues were saying, what Christos said this morning. Standardization is industry-driven. We have the experts in the industry who have the biggest expertise in the most emerging technologies. They're the right people writing the standards, developing the standards to enable this emerging technology to be placed on the market. So that's also my point. We need to rebuild the trust in the expertise of the European industry experts who are developing the standards, the European standards. And that's why when standard is developed, of course, if it is a harmonized standard, it has to comply with the European legislation. So we are also helping the European Commission by providing reports of compliance of these standards with the European legislation. But we don't need, in addition on that, another layer of checking whether a digit after the comma is correct or not, whether it is complying with the state of the art. What is state of the art? In fact, it is not defined.
Okay, thank you very much. Antti, Antti first. I've been promising to come to you for ages, then I'll come to Greg and Arnold. And before we draw some conclusions, I also want to talk about trade for 5 minutes. But Antti.
Yes, so the profile of Europe can be utilized to make standardizing procedures here as enablers to our businesses. Now, you mentioned over there the GDPR, which is a good example. I mean, United States in the digital, they are strongly company-centric. China and Russia are more state-centric, and we are here human-centric. So it's quite a division of market, so to say. The environmental issues go very well together with that profile, so it's easy to brand together. And in fact, I think the biggest invitation for tenders ever published is the United Nations Agenda 2030. So whatever tiny elements of solutions can be provided with, the success of the company is excellent, provided that there is the way of scaling it up. Scaling it up means that there must be standards.
Thank you very much. Greg, you were dying to come in, and then Arnold.
I mean, firstly, to those people, I did begin by saying in this session that many of the systems in Europe are better than the systems globally. But don't expect me not to challenge the systems in Europe, because they're far from perfect. But in relation to this balance question, I think one of the most important things we need to do is we need to ensure that there is an appropriate balance between what a standard does and what a regulation does. And I think sometimes in the past there has been confusion between the two. And we therefore need to ensure that, particularly with harmonised standards, with the mandates the Commission are issuing, there's very clear guidance as to what it is they are asking the standardisation bodies to do. And we need to ensure that where it's regulation and about levels of ambition, that is decided in the regulation, and where it's about process, that is decided in the standard. And if we keep that clarity, then I think we will have less issue about the balance between what we want by way of consumer protection and environmental protection in Europe, and perhaps what is wanted in the rest of the world. The second point, and the final point I would make, is it is inevitable that the Commission is going to have to check the legality of standards. The James Elliott case said that standards are part of the legal framework of the European Union. Therefore, the Commission would not be doing its job if it wasn't checking the legal status of every detail within a standard. That's to be entirely expected. And business and standardisation bodies cannot choose what parts of the law they implement, and neither can the Commission.
Thank you very much. Arnold.
I think I'll leave that part of the discussion. If I may, I'd like to go back on a couple of things from the floor, but particularly from Amanda. She mentioned guides. Yeah. I just think people may not be aware that ANEC has produced 5 guides for the consumer issues on the digital front. And I think those are really worth taking a look at as a help in standardisation in this area. And if I may also, just one point on the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. Here, yes, it's a very good first step, but actually we found 1 or 2 holes in it, which we are slightly concerned about, particularly around the fact that personal data is excluded, but then we put our personal data up onto the cloud and in all sorts of places, which then, according to the interpretation I've had at the moment from within the UK, is the responsibility of the data controller of the person in the cloud. So we need a little bit of guidance and things there in that particular area, but it's an excellent piece of work.
When it comes to international cooperation, I wanted just to touch briefly on the trade question, an enormous question I know, and therefore to touch on it briefly, almost impossible. But the State Secretary underlined the importance of standards in healthy trade relations. But we're in a challenging environment for international trade, to put it mildly. What do you see, and I was struck by something Tim said when he said, we need political answers, but we mustn't politicise technical standards. In terms of the role standards can play in maintaining a healthy trading relationship in challenging times, how do you see that? I mean, and do they provide a way, perhaps, for us to chart a way through the minefield? Any thoughts on that before we draw conclusions? Javier?
Yes, and thank you for coming back to this topic of globalization of standardization, which is, I think, also very important. I think it was Pascal before who made a reference to the influence in international standardization from Europe. I think it's clear, and there's a clear commitment, because this is what we listen, especially in the current times with the difficulties at the WTO and at the international level, to commit. We were invited by our Secretary General of ISO and the IC to speak out loud in this kind of cases. So yes, international standards is a commitment of the European standardization system. It's a commitment. And but I think there is an element that we must have in mind. Influence in international standardization, be it ISO, IEC, influence is not necessarily dominance. And I think we have to be smarter from Europe in terms of understanding that if we want other regions of the world, other countries to buy in, to commit more intensely, like we do in Europe through the Vienna Agreement, through the Frankfurt Agreement in particular in the ICE, if we want other regions of the world to commit to a system that they do see as too European dominated, we need to better communicate. We need to change some of our attitudes and some of our ways of getting
Is that the perception in those developing countries? You talked at the beginning about them wanting to get more involved. They see it as too Europe-dominated still.
This is my understanding.
So that we need to address.
Participating in such similar meetings like this one in other regions. Yeah.
Brief one, if you would, Nevian, and then we'll draw some conclusions.
Yes, this is what I also wanted to add, that currently it is a fact that European standards are used worldwide, especially in the area of communication, connectivity, and we know that, name it, Asia Pacific, Africa, South America, even in North American countries, you can see references to European standards, to ETSI standards as well. So going back to globalization, 5G, Internet of Things, so intelligent cars, autonomous cars, this must be global. So that's why it is very important to strengthen the global cooperation. We are already participating in global standardization cooperation with other standardization bodies, standards development organizations from worldwide, from all the continents. And that's the asset which we have in Europe, that by this collaboration we can promote European standards for early adoption in all these areas. And that's also important to say that timeliness of European standards is very important in order to be sure that the European standards are the first one which are addressing emerging technologies.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are almost out of time and I want to try and draw. So was there something burning you wanted to add, Paul, please?
Well, about this question.
Yeah, of trade,
maybe,
yeah.
If you allow me.
Please.
Before we talk about abandoning the country representation system in the international standards organizations, we should realize that it is that system in its current form that greatly contributes to a superb position of Europe to influence global standards and to get what we want, provided that we play the game in a way that is productive. And I won't repeat it again at length, but we are wasting our biggest asset at that point. And to the James Elliott case, I just want to say one thing. The remark only made clear what is broadly the case. It's widely misunderstood as to its meaning and its scope. It pertains only to the Construction Products Directive. That's very different in terms of harmonization than all the other directives. So that should be reconsidered.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we are almost out of time. I want to start at that end with my last question, and it is very similar, just in terms of priorities, because I think it's always helpful not to try and agree among ourselves on a priority, but to identify some priorities. And Antti, I'll start with you, and it's the same question to you all. And it can be a priority for policymakers, for standardizers, for anyone you like. But in terms of making sure, we've talked a lot about how important it is that Europe leads, influences, doesn't dominate, to pick up on what you said, but plays this central role in a global context, important for our companies, important for our economies as a whole. If you had to identify one priority for action to meet these challenges in a global context, what would it be and who's it for? Antti, you first.
Okay, yes. I have one leading comment to make to build it, and that is concerning the joint interest globally. You mentioned the 5G and several digital themes. Well, climate issue is clearly one, because reducing the emissions needs to be harmonized and reduced, and because anyways the whole world experiences the outcome uniformly.
Yeah.
So it is important to harmonize that.
Thank
too.
you. And your priority?
But to do that, we need this influencing, interactive. In the last session we learned that talking is important, listening maybe even more so. Interaction is important, and if you allow just a tiny joke, because I used to chair the Finnish-Russian Innovation Working Group in the past. And we had a meeting in Helsinki, and I said from my micro, I said that, and to conclude, networking is extremely important. It's absolutely important. It's so important that